A 7-year-old girl stares at rubble where a chocolate wrapper lies, and an American pilot trained to bomb Germany learns that kindness dropped from the sky can change history more than any weapon. The letter she wrote became a bridge between enemies between 1948 and 1972, between a desperate child and a compassionate pilot who would return as her family. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the course of post-war reconciliation forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The winter of 1948 finds Mercedes Simon standing in the courtyard of her Berlin home, surrounded by white chickens pecking at dust where gardens once grew. She is 7 years old, born into a world already at war. Her earliest memories composed of air raid sirens, the thunder of bombs, the peculiar orange glow that lit the sky when incendiary weapons turned city blocks into furnaces. She remembers her father only from photographs now, a Wehrmacht soldier who disappeared into the vast graveyard of the Eastern Front, one among millions who never returned from the snowfields of Russia. Her mother, Elsa Simon, survives through what seems impossible even to those who witness it, working from dawn until darkness, clearing rubble from streets, earning occupation currency that purchases less each week as inflation devours what little value money retains. The courtyard where Mercedes stands measures perhaps 15 meters square, surrounded by apartment buildings that lost their upper floors to British Lancaster bombers in 1944. The remaining structures lean at angles that engineering cannot explain, held upright by some combination of structural luck and the weight of rubble stacked around their foundations. Windows lack glass, replaced by boards or oiled paper that provides minimal protection against weather. The chickens, 4 hens, and a rooster represent the family's insurance against total starvation. They produce eggs irregularly, maybe 2 or 3 per week. The birds themselves malnourished, their feed consisting of whatever insects they can scratch from the dirt mixed with grain purchased at prices that require trading household possessions on the black market. 3 years after the guns fell silent, the war refuses to end. The city sprawls in devastation, 2 million people trapped in the western sectors, encircled by Soviet forces who have closed every road, every rail line, every waterway. On June 24, 1948, Stalin orders the blockade complete. No food trucks, no coal trains, no milk for children. The message arrives clear: surrender Berlin or watch it starve. The geopolitical forces that created this situation exist beyond Mercedes's comprehension. She knows nothing of Yalta or Potsdam, the conferences where Allied leaders divided Germany into occupation zones, partitioning Berlin itself into 4 sectors despite the city's location deep within the Soviet zone. She does not understand how wartime alliance between Western democracies and Soviet Union fractured into Cold War confrontation within months of Germany's surrender. The complex negotiations over currency reform, the Western introduction of the Deutsche Mark to replace the worthless Reichsmark, the Soviet response of closing access routes to Berlin, these policy decisions occur in rooms where men in suits debate while children like Mercedes experience the consequences. Mercedes understands hunger. She understands that American bombers once turned her city into an inferno, that her father never came home from the Eastern Front, that her mother works 16-hour shifts in the rubble gangs, clearing debris for pennies. She understands that winter approaches and there is no fuel. The white chickens in her yard represent the family's last desperate hedge against starvation. But the birds produce few eggs, their feathers falling out from malnutrition that mirrors the city itself. Above her head, aircraft engines thunder in a rhythm that has become the city's new heartbeat. Every few minutes, another American plane descends toward Tempelhof Airport, the intervals so regular that Berliners set watches by them. 3 minutes between aircraft during peak operations, a precision that seems impossible until one observes the system functioning day after day. The sound itself evolves from terror to salvation in the 3 years since war's end. Mercedes's earliest memories include diving into cellars when air raid sirens announced incoming bombers, the whistle of falling bombs, the concussive impacts that shook dust from ceiling beams, the smell of burning that permeated everything during the firestorm raids that turned entire neighborhoods into crematoriums. The same aircraft types now arrive carrying flour instead of explosives, coal instead of incendiaries, dried milk instead of death. The psychological adjustment required to accept this transformation challenges adults who remember bombing campaigns. For children like Mercedes, the aircraft simply represent the source of survival, the means by which the surrounded city continues to exist, carrying flour or coal or powdered milk instead of bombs. The Douglas C-54 Skymaster, a four-engine transport with a wingspan of 117 feet 6 inches, can haul 10 tons of cargo across the Allied air corridors that Soviet forces grudgingly permit. The aircraft flies at altitudes between 10,000 and 15,000 feet, unpressurized, the crews breathing oxygen through masks, navigating in all weather 24 hours each day. The operational tempo seems incomprehensible until one observes the choreography that makes it possible. One aircraft lands every 3 minutes at the peak of operations, each approaching along identical flight path, descending through a precisely defined corridor between apartment blocks that leave margin for error measured in meters rather than kilometers. The city's survival depends on mathematics, 2 million people requiring 1,300 tons of supplies daily, later increasing to 4,500 tons as winter approaches. The pilots flying these missions possess no illusions about their former enemy, or so they believe at mission start. Lieutenant Gail Seymour Halvorson, born October 10, 1920 in Salt Lake City, Utah, grew up during the Great Depression, learned the value of work on his family's small farm in Garland, Utah, where sugar beets and drought defined the economy. He learned to fly in his teens, captivated by barnstorming pilots who landed in farm fields to offer rides for $1, working odd jobs to accumulate money for flying lessons, soloing at 18 with pride that comes from achieving a goal through personal sacrifice. The rural Utah of his youth existed far from European conflicts, but Pearl Harbor transformed every young American man's future. Halvorson joined the United States Army Air Corps in 1942, entering a military rapidly expanding to fight wars on 2 oceans and multiple continents. He trained as fighter pilot with the Royal Air Force under exchange programs that allowed American pilots to gain experience from British instructors who had survived the Battle of Britain. The training emphasized aggression, precision gunnery, aircraft recognition, and the essential understanding that hesitation meant death. Germans were the enemy, efficient, ruthless, possessing advanced technology and combat experience gained through years of warfare. The training films showed no mercy because the war showed none. Total war meant exactly that: the complete mobilization of entire societies toward mutual destruction, where distinctions between military and civilian targets blurred into the overarching objective of breaking the enemy's capacity and will to resist. His actual war assignment sent him not to fighter cockpits over Europe, but to transport operations in the South Atlantic Theater, flying cargo missions over Brazil and West Africa, ferrying supplies along routes that connected American production capacity to combat zones in Europe and North Africa. The assignment lacked the glamour of fighter combat, carried none of the recognition that bomber crews received, but demanded skills that would prove essential during the Berlin airlift. Transport pilots learned precision navigation over featureless ocean and jungle, mastered dead reckoning when radio navigation failed, developed the mental discipline required for 10-hour flights alone with engines and instruments, gained experience managing fuel consumption, calculating cargo weights, adapting to weather that rendered visibility zero. He never flew combat over Germany, never dropped bombs on Berlin, but his training emphasized one inviolable truth. Germans were the enemy, cruel, merciless, deserving of total defeat. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender and received it in May 1945, leaving Germany divided, occupied, its cities reduced to skeletal ruins where survivors lived in cellars and subway tunnels. Now, Lieutenant Halvorson flies a C-54 Skymaster into Berlin's Tempelhof Airport, part of Operation Vittles, the Allied airlift designated by a name that emphasizes the fundamental nature of what the aircraft carry: food, fuel, the basics of life. Each mission lasts approximately 90 minutes from takeoff at Rhein-Main Air Base near Frankfurt to landing in Berlin, unloading, and returning, though this simplified summary conceals the complexity each flight requires. The mission begins with pre-flight inspection, the pilot and crew walking around the aircraft checking control surfaces, examining engines for oil leaks or loose fittings, verifying that cargo loaded properly with weight distributed to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity within acceptable limits. Improper loading can render an aircraft uncontrollable, the weight shifting during flight, the balance changing as fuel burns, the consequences potentially catastrophic. The inspection complete, the crew boards, settles into positions refined through repetition, begins the startup sequence. For Pratt and Whitney engines coughing to life, propellers spinning, the aircraft vibrating with power barely contained by brakes and pilot control inputs. Takeoff requires full power, the heavily loaded aircraft consuming runway length, the moment of rotation where the nose lifts feeling different each time depending on exact weight, wind conditions, air temperature that affects engine performance. The climb to altitude occurs slowly, the aircraft groaning under its burden, reaching assigned altitude of 10 to 15,000 feet, settling into cruise configuration where pilots adjust manifold pressure and propeller RPM to optimize fuel consumption against speed requirements. The flight path follows established corridors, narrow air routes through Soviet-controlled airspace that represent the only legal access to Berlin. Soviet fighters occasionally pace the transports, a reminder that permission to use the corridors can be revoked, that the tenuous access depends on Stalin's calculation that shooting down Allied aircraft would trigger war he does not want. The crews work 3 missions daily, sometimes 4, moving through exhaustion into a mechanical routine where precision replaces thought. Sleep becomes luxury rationed as carefully as fuel. The approach into Tempelhof demands perfection. The airport sits in the city's center, surrounded by apartment buildings that create a narrow approach corridor. Pilots descend through a glide path with no margin for error, landing on runways that crumble under constant pounding from heavily loaded aircraft. One mistake, one aborted landing, one aircraft forced to circle because it missed its approach window, and the pilot must return to base with his cargo still aboard. The system tolerates no deviation. Every 3 minutes, another Skymaster arrives. July 17, 1948, Lieutenant Halvorsen obtains rare permission for personal time during a Berlin stopover, a deviation from normal routine, where crews remain with aircraft during rapid turnaround, eating hasty meals, resting in crew quarters, returning to cockpits for next mission. The permission comes from sympathetic operations officer who recognizes that unrelenting operational tempo produces diminishing returns as exhaustion degrades performance. Halvorsen walks away from Tempelhof, camera in hand, a Kodak box camera purchased before deployment, intending to document the destruction for family back home who hear news reports but cannot imagine the reality. Utah farms feature buildings that stand for generations. The notion of entire cities reduced to rubble exceeds imagination without visual evidence. He walks with no specific destination, following streets cleared through debris, passing women with shovels and buckets, children playing in bomb craters filled with stagnant water, old men sitting on broken walls staring at nothing with eyes that have seen too much. The city appears worse than intelligence reports suggested, worse than photographs convey, worse than imagination prepares one to witness. Block after block of collapsed buildings stretch to horizons, mountains of rubble pushed to the sides of streets cleared by hand labor, the work of clearing proceeding at pace measured in meters per day, years required to remove the debris of destruction accomplished in hours. The scale defeats comprehension. How many buildings? How many tons of brick and stone and timber? How many families displaced, killed, scattered? The statistics exist somewhere, compiled by occupation authorities, but the numbers mean nothing compared to the visual impact of standing at an intersection where every direction shows only ruins. Some buildings remain partially standing, empty shells with walls and no roofs, no floors, no windows, just masonry frames surrounding voids where rooms once contained the furniture and photographs and accumulated possessions that comprise lives. Other sites show only rubble heaps, no structure remaining. The buildings collapsed completely, crushed under the weight of their own materials. Women bent under loads of brick, children searching debris for anything salvageable, old men standing motionless, their eyes hollow. Halvorsen walks to the airport's perimeter fence, where a group of 30 children watch aircraft landing. Drawn by the spectacle, the noise, the sheer presence of machines representing power and purpose in a world that seems to have exhausted both. They stand silent, pressed against chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, faces pinched with hunger that produces a particular appearance Halvorsen recognizes from newsreels of concentration camp liberations, the hollow cheeks, the skin stretched tight over bones, the eyes that seem too large for faces, the listless quality of malnourished bodies conserving energy. Their clothes tell stories of deprivation, garments patched and repatched, adult coats cut down to child size, dresses made from curtains or blankets, anything with fabric serving as clothing regardless of original purpose. Shoes present particular problem. Children's feet growing rapidly, leather footwear precious and rare. Many children wearing shoes wrapped with wire to hold disintegrating soles together, or wooden clogs carved from salvage timber, or simply going barefoot despite summer ending and cold weather approaching. The children do not beg. This detail strikes Halvorsen immediately, violating his expectations formed from experience in other impoverished areas where children mobbed servicemen, hands out voices competing for attention, the aggressive desperation of those who understand that loudest pleas sometimes receive reward. American children would crowd forward, hands out, voices raised. These German children stand quiet, watching the aircraft with an intensity that suggests the planes represent more than machinery. They represent survival. Halvorsen approaches the fence, and the children edge back slightly, wary but curious. He speaks no German beyond a few phrases. They speak no English. He reaches into his pocket, finding 2 sticks of Wrigley's Double Mint chewing gum, the narrow green foil packages that every American serviceman carries. He breaks the sticks into pieces, passing them through the fence. 30 children receive perhaps 40 small fragments of gum, the mathematics of scarcity operating with precision born from practice. They divide these fragments further through process that appears choreographed though no one directs it, older children breaking pieces in half, quarters sharing with younger siblings or friends, establishing hierarchy based on something other than strength, perhaps age, perhaps friendship bonds, perhaps calculations about who needs it most or who shared something yesterday. Some children end up merely smelling the wrapper, because no actual gum reaches them, the green foil wrapper from Wrigley's Double Mint package carrying scent of mint that represents luxury beyond calculation. The child who smells the wrapper does so slowly, deliberately, eyes closed, committing the experience to memory, knowing this might be the only contact with such things for months or years. The scent of mint, familiar to American children as background commonplace, registers to Berlin children as exotic treasure, evidence that somewhere in the world abundance exists, that factories operate producing non-essential items for simple pleasure, that supply chains function delivering trivial luxuries to people who expect them as routine. The sharing occurs without fighting, without tears, without the chaos that adults might expect from giving insufficient resource to a group of hungry children. One boy, perhaps 9 years old, carefully folds his wrapper, creasing it along existing folds, tucking it into his pocket, as if it were currency, which in certain sense it is. The wrapper possessing trading value on black markets where American goods command premium prices, where anything with English writing suggests access to occupation forces and the relative wealth they represent. A girl inhales the scent of mint as though it were perfume. None fight, none cry out for more. The restraint, the dignity in their hunger breaks something in Halvorsen's perception. These are not the monsters from training films. They are starving children who have lost everything, who watch the sky not with hatred but with hope that the aircraft will keep coming. Halvorsen makes a promise he has no authority to make. He tells the children through gestures and fractured words that he will return tomorrow, that he will bring more gum and candy, that he will drop it from his aircraft as he approaches the runway. One girl asks how they will know which plane is his. The C-54 Skymasters all look identical, bare metal fuselages with Air Force markings, nothing distinguishing one from another in a procession of aircraft landing every 3 minutes. Halvorsen says he will wiggle his wings, rock the aircraft from side to side as he passes over. They will know him by this sign. Uncle Wiggly Wings, the children will later call him, though at this moment no one knows this gesture will become famous. That night in his barracks at Rhine-Main Air Base, Halvorsen confronts the various forms of stupidity his promise contains, the operational challenges, the regulatory violations, the physical dangers, the potential consequences. He lies on his bunk in quarters shared with 3 other pilots, the room Spartan military-issue furniture, footlockers, photographs tacked to walls, the smell of cigarette smoke and aviation fuel that permeates everything near airfields. Sleep eludes him as his mind cycles through problems. He has no authorization to drop anything from his aircraft during approach, full stop. Regulation forbids any object leaving the aircraft during approach, the prohibition based on sound reasoning born from accumulated experience. Approach requires total concentration, the pilot managing airspeed, altitude, descent rate, power settings, trim adjustments, flap configuration, all while monitoring instruments, watching for the runway through windscreen, listening to radio calls from approach control, coordinating with crew, preparing for landing or possible go-around if anything appears wrong. Any distraction during this phase, any division of attention, any object moving through the cockpit, anything creating confusion or blocking controls could cause disaster. Aircraft accidents during approach kill crews and destroy aircraft needed for operations. The regulation exists to prevent such disasters, written in blood from previous incidents where minor distractions produce catastrophic results. He owns no candy beyond his personal ration, the small allotment of sweets that military provides to personnel, chocolate bars and gum, included in PX supplies, treats that Americans take for granted but represent unattainable luxury for German civilians who receive minimum calorie rations insufficient for active life. His personal stash amounts to perhaps 3 Hershey bars and several packages of gum, quantities sufficient for one person's occasional indulgence, but laughably inadequate for 30 hungry children who will hear he promised candy and arrive expecting delivery. The arithmetic defeats hope. 3 candy bars divided among 30 children produces fragments too small to satisfy anyone, the gesture seeming cruel in its insufficiency, raising expectations only to demonstrate their futility. He has no parachutes to slow the falling candy, meaning anything dropped will hit the ground at terminal velocity, becoming projectile, potentially injuring the children he intends to help. A Hershey bar dropped from 10,000 feet, falling through thin air, accelerating under gravity, reaches velocity sufficient to cause injury on impact. The chocolate might shatter, becoming shrapnel. The wrapper might tear, scattering contents. Even if the candy survives impact intact, the fall location remains unpredictable, wind drift carrying small objects far from intended target, the candy potentially landing in streets where trucks crush it, or on rooftops beyond reach, or in Soviet sectors where possession of American goods brings interrogation about Western contacts. These obstacles accumulate into a sensible case for abandoning the entire idea, writing it off as impulse spoken without thinking, the kind of casual promise people make knowing circumstances will excuse non-delivery. The children accustomed to disappointment will watch for 1 day, perhaps 2, then accept that the American-made empty promise, another adult whose words mean nothing. Their lives will continue as before, hungry, cold, waiting for aircraft that bring coal and flour but not miracles. Halvorsen could let this outcome occur, suffering minor guilt that fades with time, the entire episode forgotten within weeks. These obstacles do not cancel his decision. They merely define the problems he must solve. The distinction matters. Some people, confronted with obstacles, accept impossibility and cease trying. Others view obstacles as challenges requiring creative solution, the difficulty intensifying commitment rather than eroding it. Halvorsen belongs to the latter category, the problem solvers who transformed American farms and factories, who built the Liberty ships and B-29 bombers, who approached every challenge during the Depression and war years with attitude that solutions existed if one worked hard enough to find them. Halvorsen consults his crew, co-pilot Lieutenant John Pickering and flight engineer Sergeant Herschel Elkins, explaining the situation, the promise made, the problems confronting delivery, the likely consequences if command discovers unauthorized cargo drops during approach. Pickering and Elkins could refuse participation, protecting their careers, letting Halvorsen face disciplinary action alone. Instead, they offer assistance, pooling their candy rations, contributing their technical expertise to solving the parachute problem, accepting shared risk because the cause seems worth it. 3 men contribute 3 Hershey bars and several pieces of gum. The combined resources marginally better than one-man's supply, but still insufficient for 30 children. They discuss rationing strategies, perhaps breaking each bar into 10 pieces, stretching the candy across multiple drops, but the calculations remain depressing. The solution requires increasing supply. But where does candy come from in post-war Germany where everything remains rationed? Where civilians receive calorie allotments calculated to prevent starvation while discouraging black market development, where sugar exists as rare commodity commanding prices that make chocolate prohibitively expensive. The crew decides to sacrifice their own rations over several weeks, accumulating stockpile, but this approach only delays the problem. Eventually the candy runs out, the children's expectations now established, the disappointment when drops cease, potentially worse than never starting. From handkerchiefs requisitioned from their personal belongings and scrap string scrounged from maintenance shops, they construct tiny parachutes, each roughly the size of an adult hand, 12 to 15 inches across when spread flat. The engineering requires experimentation. They tie candy beneath with knots that must hold during fall, but release when struck, the cord wrapped multiple times, the technique refined through trial runs performed in the barracks, dropping test parachutes from upper bunks, observing deployment, checking whether the candy separates on impact or remains attached. The handkerchief material matters. Too heavy and it fails to catch air. Too light and it tears. The standard white cotton handkerchief military issue proves ideal, the fabric stiff enough to hold shape, yet light enough to billow, the corners providing attachment points for cord, the center catching air like miniature parachute canopy. The engineering is amateur 3 military pilots applying high school physics, but the principle proves sound through testing that validates theoretical predictions. A handkerchief creates sufficient drag to slow a small payload from terminal velocity to survivable descent speed, the fabric catching air, spreading into dome shape, generating resistance that allows the parachute to drift rather than plummet. They calculate approximate descent rates, estimating that parachutes deployed at 500 feet altitude, the height where approach path crosses the airport perimeter, will require 30 to 40 seconds to reach ground, drifting laterally in wind, landing softly enough that candy survives intact and children can retrieve packages safely. The margin for error remains uncomfortably narrow. Drop too early and the parachutes drift beyond the children's location. Drop too late and they land on airport property where military police will confiscate them. The window measures perhaps 2 seconds of flight time, requiring precision timing from crew working in aircraft traveling 150 miles per hour, approximately 220 feet per second, meaning 2 seconds equals 440 feet of horizontal travel, the width of several city blocks. July 18, 1948, Halvorsen flies his scheduled mission into Tempelhof carrying 10 tons of coal, the black dust coating everything despite tarps covering the cargo, the aircraft's interior perpetually gray from coal residue that no amount of cleaning entirely removes. The flight proceeds normally through startup, taxi, takeoff, climb, cruise, the route following established airways, the crew performing checks and monitoring systems with attention that never quite becomes complacent because aircraft at gross weight, flying over Soviet territory, carry risks that demand respect. The approach begins normally, Berlin's distinctive landmarks appearing through haze. The radio calls establishing position in the landing sequence, the descent profile standard, altitude reducing at prescribed rate, airspeed holding steady, everything proceeding according to procedure until Halvorsen announces to his crew that the wing wiggle happens now. He rocks the wings, 2 tilts left, 2 tilts right, control column moving deliberately, the motion felt throughout the aircraft's unpressurized fuselage as the horizon tilts in windscreen, the loaded aircraft responding sluggishly to control inputs, the wing wobble obvious to anyone watching from ground. His crew, positioned at a small window near the tail section, waits for the predetermined signal, then pushes the handkerchief parachutes into the slipstream. 3 parachutes on this first attempt, the experimental run that will determine whether the concept functions or fails. The slipstream catches the parachutes immediately, ripping them from Elkin's hands, the fabric deploying instantly in the 200-mile-per-hour wind, the parachutes yanked backward, tumbling briefly before air resistance stabilizes them into descent configuration. Elkins watches them fall through the small window, tracking their descent for perhaps 3 seconds before the aircraft's forward motion carries him past visual. Range, the parachutes drifting down toward apartment blocks, their fate unknown. The parachutes catch air, deploy with satisfying symmetry, drift down over the apartment blocks surrounding the airport, white squares of fabric descending like summer snow. Halvorsen cannot see where they land, cannot verify success, cannot know if children below even notice them falling. He must focus on the approach, the narrow corridor between buildings that frame the runway, the alignment that must be perfect, the descent rate that must hold steady, the airspeed that must neither increase nor decrease beyond narrow tolerance. The landing proceeds normally, gear extending with reassuring thunk, flaps deploying to increase lift at lower speeds, the runway rising to meet the aircraft, the touchdown gentle despite the weight, the rollout consuming most of the runway's length before the aircraft slows sufficiently to exit onto taxiway. The crew completes shutdown procedures, fills out paperwork, says nothing about the wing wobble or the parachutes, the entire deviation occupying perhaps 30 seconds of a 90-minute mission. The mission completes normally by official metrics: cold delivered, aircraft landed safely, crew and plane ready for next assignment. He files no report of the deviation, the mission paperwork containing no mention of unauthorized cargo or non-standard approach procedures, the omission technically a lie of silence. The next day, he returns on another scheduled mission, wiggles the wings again, drops more parachutes, 6 this time, the crew's confidence growing with practice, the technique becoming routine despite its irregularity. On the 3rd day, 12 parachutes. On the 4th, they drop parachutes on 2 missions, morning and evening flights, the candy supply now seriously depleted, the crew wondering how long they can sustain operations before either running out of supplies or getting caught. The children find them within minutes of landing, the white parachutes visible against gray rubble, the packages retrieved with excitement that spreads through neighborhood faster than any announcement system. A boy named Peter retrieves the first parachute from a rooftop, climbing up crumbling brick despite obvious danger, finds 2 pieces of Hershey bar wrapped in brown wax paper, divides them among 6 friends in process that involves negotiation and mathematics, everyone receiving fair share. The taste of chocolate triggering memories of peacetime some children are too young to actually remember, the sweetness so intense after years of ersatz foods and calorie rations that some children make it last by taking tiny bites, holding each piece in mouth until it dissolves. A girl discovers one caught in a tree, parachute tangled in branches 3 meters above ground, climbs up despite her mother's shouting warnings about weak limbs and dangerous heights, brings down the treasure like a medieval knight, recovering a holy relic, the parachute itself becoming valuable possession, the handkerchief something to keep, to show friends, to preserve as evidence of the miracle. Word spreads among Berlin's children faster than any radio broadcast, the news traveling through schools and playgrounds, across apartment buildings where families crowd into damaged structures, through neighborhoods where children form the communication network because adults remain too exhausted or depressed to socialize. The American pilot with the wiggly wings brings candy from the sky, real chocolate, American chocolate, the kind that melts in your mouth instead of tasting like wax, Hershey bars with English writing on the wrapper, proof of connection to that distant place called America, where factories produce such things in quantities sufficient for casual distribution. Children congregate near the airport approach path, staking out positions in yards and empty lots, watching for the signal among the endless procession of aircraft, learning to identify the particular wobble pattern that marks the candy bomber's plane, running after the parachutes that drift down like promises that the world has not entirely abandoned them, that someone somewhere cares enough to add something extra, something not required, something given purely from kindness rather than strategic calculation or occupation duty. The operation cannot remain secret despite the crew's silence, cannot stay hidden when children tell parents, when parents mention it to neighbors, when word spreads through community networks that reconnect slowly after war's fragmentation. On July 25, 1948, exactly 1 week after the first drop, Frankfurt's base commander receives a peculiar letter addressed simply to the chocolate pilot, the envelope bearing no name or rank, just this designation that someone assumes will reach the correct recipient despite military postal systems requiring proper addressing. A German child writes, thanking the American pilot who drops candy, the letter expressing gratitude in careful handwriting learned in makeshift schools, the words simple but sincere, the envelope addressed with hope that someone will know who should receive it. Then more letters arrive. 20 letters, 50, 100 letters within 2 weeks. Some include maps of Berlin with arrows pointing to apartment buildings, instructions specifying backyards, plazas, parks where children gather. One letter reads, I'll be in my backyard every day at 2 o'clock. Drop the chocolate there. Another notes, we live near the tall chimney on Hermanstrasse. You cannot miss us. Lieutenant Halvorson's commander, Major General William Tunner, could order the operation stopped. Dropping anything from aircraft during approach violates procedure, and procedure keeps the airlift functioning. Yet, Tunner possesses strategic imagination. He recognizes that this accidental diplomatic mission accomplishes what propaganda cannot. Soviet broadcasts hammer Western sectors with messages that Americans care nothing for German suffering, that the airlift serves military purposes alone, that when winter comes the United States will abandon Berlin. A pilot dropping candy contradicts this narrative more effectively than any press release. Children do not debate ideology. They know who brings food. Tunner issues orders expanding the operation into official policy. Operation Little Vittles, he names it a smaller version of Operation Vittles, the airlift's overall designation. Other pilots volunteer to join. Ground crews attach candy parachutes to each aircraft's manifest. American candy manufacturers, contacted by military public affairs, donate product. Hershey ships crates of chocolate bars. The Wrigley Company sends pallets of gum. The American Confectioners Association organizes collections from the public. Children in American schools learn about Berlin's blockade, contribute their Halloween candy, tie handkerchiefs, and write letters to German children they will never meet. By September 1948, the operation runs systematically. 25 aircraft crews participate. Ground crews at Rhein-Main Air Base establish an assembly line, tying handkerchiefs to candy, loading the parachutes into boxes stacked with coal or flour. Each aircraft carries a small payload of sweetness among the tons of survival supplies. The pilots wiggle wings in sequence, creating a chain of signals above Berlin. Children track which aircraft belong to the candy bombers, memorize the numbers painted on tails, the specific wobble patterns each pilot uses. Mercedes Simon watches every day. She stands in her courtyard with the white chickens, shading her eyes against the sun, tracking aircraft silhouettes. She never catches a parachute. They drift to other neighborhoods, other yards, other children whose luck runs better. The injustice of this burns with particular intensity when one is 7 years old and hungry. She complains to her grandmother, who suggests writing a letter. Children write letters to God and Santa Claus. Perhaps they can write to American pilots. Mercedes writes in German, her script careful and practiced, learned in a school that meets in a church basement because the school building became rubble. She addresses her letter to the chocolate pilot, includes her address, describes her home as the one with white chickens in the courtyard. She asks, with the direct honesty children possess before learning diplomatic evasion, why the parachutes always fall elsewhere. She posts the letter through what remains of Berlin's postal system, the letter joining hundreds of others in mail bags flown to American bases. The letter reaches Lieutenant Halvorsen in October 1948. He sits in his quarters, reading through the week's accumulation of mail, most of it thank you notes written in German and translated by interpreters. Mercedes's letter strikes him differently. The white chickens become an identifying landmark he remembers from walking the city. The question posed in a child's handwriting demands response. He cannot drop parachutes with sniper precision, cannot guarantee delivery to any specific address. Berlin stretches vast, and aircraft moving at 150 miles per hour cannot target courtyard-sized zones. Instead, Halvorsen assembles a care package, candy, and gum purchased from the PX, items he wraps in brown paper. He writes a reply letter explaining he cannot find the white chickens from altitude, that this package comes by mail instead, that he hopes it arrives safely. He signs the letter and mails it through military postal services, which route packages to German addresses through the airlift network. The package reaches Mercedes in November 1948 as Berlin's first winter under blockade settles in. Temperatures drop below freezing. Coal supplies, despite the airlift, run chronically short. The city's gas system provides service 2 hours daily. Electricity comes in rotating blackouts, each district receiving power in 4-hour blocks. People burn furniture, books, wooden fences, anything combustible. The elderly die from cold, their bodies stacking in morgues because frozen ground prevents burial. Children develop tuberculosis, rickets, respiratory infections that flourish in unheated tenements. Mercedes opens the package, with her mother watching, her younger siblings crowding close. The Hershey bars represent wealth beyond calculation. Chocolate trades on Berlin's black market for extraordinary value, but Mercedes's mother forbids selling it. The candy divides among family members, rationed to last weeks. A single square of chocolate becomes a day's celebration. Mercedes keeps the letter, folding it carefully, storing it in a box with her few possessions, the handwriting proof that an American pilot, trained to see Germans as enemies, took time to respond personally to a child's request. The blockade continues through winter. Soviet authorities anticipate Western collapse, calculating that logistics cannot sustain 2 million people by air alone. The numbers support this assumption. Aircraft carry tons. Cities consume thousands of tons. Mathematics favors the blockade. Yet the airlift intensifies. The Allies add more aircraft, refine procedures, engineer solutions to problems that emerge. The runways at Tempelhof, designed for pre-war traffic, disintegrate under the pounding of hundreds of daily landings. Engineers lay new surfaces, pierced steel planking first, then proper pavement, working 24 hours to complete sections while operations continue on parallel runways. When winter fog grounds aircraft, the Allies develop ground-controlled approach radar, talking pilots down through zero visibility with precision that seems impossible until it becomes routine. The C-54 Skymaster proves itself the operation's backbone. The aircraft, originally designated Douglas DC for in civilian life, receives military modifications that optimize cargo capacity. Maximum takeoff weight reaches 73,000 pounds. For Pratt & Whitney are 2,000 twin Wasp engines, each producing 1,450 horsepower, burn fuel at rates requiring 3,500 gallons of aviation gasoline for each mission. Cruising speed holds steady at 190 miles per hour. Service ceiling reaches 22,400 feet, though Berlin missions fly much lower. The aircraft lacks pressurization, meaning crews and any passengers endure the cold of altitude without comfort. Maintenance crews service each aircraft after every mission, replacing spark plugs, checking control surfaces, topping fluids, refueling, reloading cargo in choreographed sequences that minimize ground time. Halvorsen flies multiple missions weekly throughout late 1948 and early 1949. Operation Little Vittles expands beyond initial planning. The candy parachutes multiply in volume, reaching 250,000 individual parachutes delivered during the airlift's 15-month duration. The weight of candy dropped totals approximately 23 tons, a fraction of the 2.3 million tons of supplies the complete operation delivers, yet the psychological impact exceeds any proportional calculation. Newsreels broadcast footage of children catching parachutes, of pilots loading candy, of American schools making handkerchiefs. The Soviet propaganda narrative, insisting Americans care nothing for German welfare, collapses against visual evidence that American pilots risk regulation violations to bring chocolate to enemy children. Stalin's blockade breaks against Western persistence and German endurance. On May 12, 1949, Soviet forces lift the restrictions on ground transportation. The roads open. Trains run. Barges move on canals. The blockade achieved nothing except proving that former enemies could become allies when necessity demanded. The airlift continues through September 30, 1949, building stockpiles against any future blockade attempt, then officially ends. Aircraft return to routine transport duties. Pilots receive reassignments. Lieutenant Halvorsen leaves Berlin, continues his Air Force career, serves in various capacities through promotions that eventually bring him to colonel rank. Mercedes Simon grows up in a Berlin slowly rebuilding. The rubble clears gradually, cleared by hand labor, by women known as Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, who form human chains passing bricks from destroyed buildings to salvage piles where usable materials separate from waste. New construction begins in the 1950s, modern buildings rising on sites where medieval structures stood before Allied bombing. The white chickens disappear, eaten or died, no longer necessary in a city where food becomes available again. Mercedes attends school, completes her education, marries Peter Wilde, raises children in a Germany divided between East and West, but no longer starving. She keeps the letter. Through all transitions, all moves, all the accumulated chaos of adult life, Mercedes preserves the letter from the American pilot. It sits in a box of important documents, yellowing paper, ink fading slightly, the handwriting still legible, the signature still clear. She tells her children the story of the candy bombers, of watching aircraft overhead, of writing to a pilot who responded with kindness when he could have ignored one child's letter among thousands. 1972 brings Colonel Gail Halvorsen back to Berlin, this time as commander of Tempelhof Central Airport, the same facility where he landed C-54s during the airlift. The assignment carries significance. The United States maintains significant military presence in Berlin, the city and occupied territory under four-power agreements that continue into the Cold War's third decade. Tempelhof functions as both civilian and military facility, a symbol of Allied commitment to West Berlin's freedom. The base commander position requires diplomatic skill alongside military competence. Halvorsen, by now famous as the Candy Bomber, represents ideal selection for this role. News of Halvorsen's assignment spreads through Berlin's German community. Many who remember the airlift still live in the city, now middle-aged, their children learning history that the parents lived through. Organizations extend invitations for Halvorsen to speak, to attend commemorations, to visit schools where children learn about the airlift as historical event rather than lived experience. Mercedes Wilde, reading newspaper coverage of the new base commander's arrival, recognizes the name. The chocolate pilot has returned. She discusses with her husband the possibility of extending an invitation to dinner. The idea seems presumptuous. Why would a base commander, a colonel with ceremonial and operational responsibilities, accept a dinner invitation from an ordinary German family? Yet the alternative, allowing the opportunity to pass, seems worse. Mercedes writes a letter, this one in adult handwriting, introducing herself as the girl with the white chickens, mentioning the letter she still possesses from 1948. She posts the invitation, expecting polite refusal. Halvorsen responds immediately, accepting the invitation. He arrives at the Wild family home in civilian clothes, bringing flowers as German courtesy demands, accompanied by no staff or security. Mercedes brings out the letter, still in its original envelope, the paper fragile now after 24 years of storage. Halvorsen holds it carefully, reads his own handwriting, remembers writing it in a barracks room after flying missions into a city gripped by winter and blockade. The moment connects 1948 to 1972, connects the young lieutenant who gave away his candy ration to the colonel who commanded aircraft operations, connects the hungry 7-year-old to the woman with husband and children living in prosperity that seemed impossible during those frozen months. The evening extends beyond dinner. Halvorsen meets the Wild children, sees photographs of Berlin's reconstruction, hears Mercedes's life story, the school years, the courtship, the marriage, the children, the ordinary progression of a life that nearly ended in childhood from starvation and cold. They discuss the blockade, comparing memories, filling gaps in each other's understanding. Halvorsen explains the operational challenges of the airlift, the exhaustion of flying multiple missions daily, the weather difficulties, the heartbreak of aircraft accidents that killed flight crews. Mercedes describes civilian life during the blockade, the hunger that became normal, the cold that seemed permanent, the fear that the aircraft would stop coming. From this evening grows a friendship that spans decades and families. The Halvorsen and Wild families maintain contact through letters, phone calls, visits when opportunity permits. Mercedes becomes unofficial German representative of the airlift's legacy, speaking at schools, appearing at commemorations, traveling to the United States to participate in Berlin airlift anniversaries. She meets American presidents alongside Halvorsen, including Bill Clinton, who honors the airlift's significance as model of humanitarian action. She works with the German-American Friendship Society, building cultural bridges between nations that fought total war a generation earlier. Halvorsen, in retirement after Air Force career concluding in 1974, dedicates significant time to sharing the airlift story. He speaks at schools internationally, demonstrating the handkerchief parachute technique that started everything, still carrying candy to distribute to children who know the story only as history. He participates in airlift reunions, where aging pilots gather to remember comrades who died in crashes, to honor the German citizens whose endurance made the operation meaningful. He receives decorations from both American and German governments, the awards accumulating through decades, recognition of the operation's lasting significance. The friendship between Mercedes Wild and Gail Halvorsen transcends the categories that typically define international relationships. They do not meet as representatives of nations or as symbolic figures. They meet as individuals connected by a moment of human kindness during a period when kindness seemed extinct. The letter Mercedes wrote as a desperate child reached a pilot who could have discarded it among hundreds of similar letters. His decision to respond personally, to take time during operational stress to address one girl's disappointment, created connection that survived decades. The white chickens mentioned in a child's letter become symbol of the story's authenticity. Historical narratives often smooth away specific details in favor of grand themes. Mercedes's story preserves the particular, the chickens in a courtyard, the specific address, the handwriting on yellowing paper. These details ground the larger narrative of the Berlin airlift, Operation Little Vittles, the Cold War's first major confrontation, in human reality. 2 million people survived the blockade through an airlift that demonstrated Western capability and determination. But individual survival depended on personal decisions, on pilots who volunteered to add candy to cargo loads, on children who maintained dignity despite hunger, on the small gestures that proved one side retained humanity while the other built walls. The Berlin airlift established templates that shaped subsequent humanitarian operations. The United Nations, Western militaries, aid organizations all study the airlift as model of logistics under pressure, of coordination between nations, of operational efficiency achieved through systematic problem solving. The numbers document success, 277,958 flights, 2.3 million tons of supplies delivered, operation sustained for 15 months under conditions that initially seemed impossible. The human cost appears in casualty figures. 31 Americans and 24 British aircrew died in accidents, along with 5 German civilians killed in aircraft crashes. 17 American and 8 British aircraft destroyed. These statistics describe the physical operation. Operation Little Vittles describes the spiritual operation, the aspect of the airlift that cannot reduce to tonnage and flight hours. 23 tons of candy distributed via handkerchief parachutes represents meaningless quantity in operational terms. The sea. 54 Skymasters carried 10-ton loads. 23 tons equals 2 aircraft missions. Yet, the candy achieved strategic objective that 10,000 tons of coal could not. It demonstrated that the Americans flying the airlift cared about German children as individuals worthy of kindness rather than as abstract population requiring minimum subsistence. The distinction mattered. Soviet propaganda depicted Americans as occupiers interested only in military advantage. A pilot wiggling his wings to signal candy drops contradicted this message in language children understood. Mercedes Simon's letter, among thousands received, represented the operation's success. She wrote not to beg, but to ask a question. Why did the parachutes land elsewhere? The question assumed fairness existed, that an American pilot would care that one child received nothing while others celebrated. Halvorson's response confirmed this assumption, demonstrating that individual German children mattered to individual American servicemen. This relationship, repeated thousands of times through letters exchanged, candy dropped, thank you notes received, built foundation for reconciliation that transformed enemies into allies. The transformation did not happen easily or completely. Germans who remembered Allied bombing of civilian targets, who lost family members in air raids, who watched their cities burn, retained bitterness that candy parachutes could not erase. Americans who fought through Europe, who liberated concentration camps, who counted friends killed by German forces, struggled to view Germans as victims requiring assistance. The moral ambiguity of post-war occupation, where former enemies became Cold War allies while former allies became Cold War adversaries, complicated every interaction. The airlift occurred because Soviet actions threatened Western strategic interests, not purely from humanitarian impulse. Operation Little Vittles happened because individual pilots made choices based on immediate human response to hungry children, not from policy directive. Yet, whatever the mixed motives, whatever the strategic calculations, whatever the institutional pressures, the outcome created genuine human connection. Mercedes Wilde did not care about geopolitics when she wrote her letter. She wanted chocolate. Gail Halvorson did not analyze Cold War dynamics when he responded. He remembered a girl with white chickens who felt disappointed. Their meeting in 1972, their subsequent friendship, their families. Connections, these developed from authentic relationship rather than political necessity. The story contains instructive irony. Halvorson, trained as fighter pilot, assigned to transport operations, never flew combat missions against Germany. He dropped supplies, not bombs, though he trained to drop bombs and would have followed orders had assignment differed. Mercedes lived through American bombing of Berlin, survived in a city reduced to rubble by Allied air raids, watched aircraft overhead that represented death before they represented salvation. Neither party could choose their historical circumstances. They inherited a war started before their birth, fought according to industrial logic that measured success in cities destroyed and populations displaced. The airlift created opportunity to transcend this inheritance. Stalin's blockade intended to force Western withdrawal from Berlin, consolidating Soviet control over the city. Instead, the blockade created conditions where former enemies cooperated in operation that saved 2 million lives. The United States, Britain, and France coordinated aircraft operations with precision that presaged NATO military cooperation. German civilians in Western sectors chose alliance with democracies that bombed their cities over alignment with Soviet Union that promised socialist solidarity. The choice proved pragmatic, based on observation that Americans brought food while Soviets imposed starvation. Operation Little Vittles transformed this pragmatic cooperation into emotional connection. Children who caught candy parachutes grew into adults who remembered American kindness during Germany's worst crisis. They raised children and grandchildren with stories of Uncle Wiggly Wings, the chocolate pilot, the candy bomber, preserving memory that resisted reduction to historical footnote. When Halvorsen returned to Berlin in 1972, he returned not as occupation commander but as welcomed guest, invited to dinner by families who remembered. Mercedes Wild's preservation of the 1948 letter demonstrated the story's significance to those who lived it. The letter represented tangible proof that one person mattered to another person across the divide of nationality, language, recent warfare, and current occupation. The paper documented that an American military officer took time to write personally to a German child, acknowledging her disappointment, explaining operational limitations, sending candy through mail when aerial delivery proved impossible. These actions required no authorization, gained no military objective, served no career advancement. They simply expressed human decency in a moment when decency seemed optional. The meeting in 1972 validated Mercedes's decision to preserve the letter and Halvorsen's decision to accept a dinner invitation from strangers. They recognized in each other the person behind historical roles. Mercedes was not generic German child saved by airlift. Halvorsen was not generic American pilot performing occupation duty. They were specific, individuals whose lives intersected at a moment that mattered, creating connection that persisted because both parties chose to maintain it. Their family's subsequent friendship demonstrated that second-generation relationships could build on first-generation foundation. The Wild children grew up knowing Uncle Gale, attending events where their mother and the American colonel shared stages, traveled to the United States for reunions where aging pilots told stories to children and grandchildren. The Halvorsen family maintained correspondence with the Wilds, visiting Berlin when opportunity allowed, hosting the Wilds in America, building relationships that existed independent of the historical event that created initial connection. This pattern of sustained personal relationship distinguished Operation Little Vittles from typical humanitarian operations. Aid programs deliver supplies, achieve objectives, conclude operations, and move to next crisis. Relationships between aid providers and aid recipients remain transactional, defined by immediate need and available resource. Operation Little Vittles created different dynamic because the operation began with spontaneous gesture rather than institutional directive. Halvorsen gave gum to hungry children before any official operation existed. His personal decision to drop candy evolved into organized program, but the personal element remained central. Letters arrived addressed to specific pilots, not to military units. Responses came from individuals who signed their names, not from public affairs offices issuing generic statements. Mercedes's letter and Halvorsen's response exemplified this personal quality. She wrote to the chocolate pilot, identifying him through action rather than name or rank. He responded as individual pilot who remembered white chickens, not as representative of occupation forces. Their correspondence established relationship that existed parallel to official operations, unofficial, and therefore authentic. The authenticity mattered because Germany's post-war reconstruction required psychological transformation alongside physical rebuilding. The rubble cleared through labor, the buildings rose through construction, the economy recovered through Marshall Plan assistance. But psychological recovery, the restoration of dignity to defeated population, the rebuilding of trust between Germans and nations that defeated Germany, this required personal interactions that demonstrated former enemies could become friends. Operation Little Vittles provided thousands of such interactions, each candy parachute creating moment, where German child and American pilot connected across the barrier of recent warfare. The pilots who participated in Operation Little Vittles did not drop candy from strategic calculation. They dropped candy because children stood hungry at fences, Because the simplest human decency demanded response, because they possessed candy and handkerchiefs and string and could therefore act. The military structure that initially threatened. Discipline for unauthorized drops ultimately embraced the operation because commanders recognized its value. The strategic benefit emerged from authentic gesture, not from planned operation that happened to appear authentic. This sequence matters for understanding how reconciliation functions. Official reconciliation programs, diplomatic initiatives, formal agreements, these create framework for peace, but do not create peace itself. Peace grows from accumulated personal interactions where former enemies discover shared humanity. The German children who caught candy parachutes did not forgive Allied bombing through rational process of understanding military necessity. They forgave to the extent forgiveness occurred, because American pilots demonstrated care for their welfare. The American pilots who participated in Operation Little Vittles did not absolve Germans of war crimes through candy drops. They recognized that starving children, whatever their parents' sins, deserved food. This recognition created foundation for deeper reconciliation. Mercedes Wild's friendship with Gail Halvorsen, extending from 1972 until Halvorsen's death in 2022 at age 101, demonstrated that relationships built on authentic human connection could survive decades. They attended each other's family events, celebrated weddings and births, mourned losses, maintained contact through the ordinary rhythms of life that define friendship. Their friendship existed because a 7-year-old girl wrote a letter and a pilot took time to respond, but it endured because both parties chose to sustain it through effort required to maintain any long-distance relationship across language and cultural barriers. The Berlin airlift ended in September 1949. The Cold War continued another 4 decades. Germany remained divided until 1990. The physical separation between East and West Berlin, eventually marked by concrete wall and guard towers, symbolized the larger division of Europe into hostile camps. Yet, within this division, connections persisted. The airlift created reservoir of goodwill in West Berlin that subsequent tensions could not entirely drain. When President John F. Kennedy declared Ich bin ein Berliner in 1963, he addressed population that remembered American aircraft bringing food when Soviets brought blockade. When President Ronald Reagan demanded Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall, in 1987 he spoke at Brandenburg Gate, miles from Tempelhof Airport where C-54 Skymasters landed every 3 minutes during the airlift. These presidential moments drew power from the airlift's legacy, from the operation that proved American commitment to Berlin's freedom extended beyond abstract principle to concrete action involving risk and sacrifice. The pilots who died in airlift crashes, the maintenance crews who worked through exhaustion, the commanders who organized operations of unprecedented scale and precision, these individuals created the credibility that later presidents invoked. Operation Little Vittles contributed to this credibility through different mechanism. The primary airlift demonstrated capability. Operation Little Vittles demonstrated care. Both elements proved necessary. Capability without care appears as mere power projection, occupation forces maintaining control through resource distribution. Care, without capability, appears as empty gesture, good intentions unable to achieve meaningful result. The combination of capability and care, demonstrated through main airlift and candy operations respectively, created the psychological impact that made the airlift historically significant beyond its logistical achievement. Mercedes Wild understood this distinction. In numerous interviews given over decades, she emphasized not the tonnage delivered or the operational efficiency achieved, but the emotional impact of knowing someone cared. Berlin's population survived the blockade through determination, through enduring cold and hunger, through trusting that Western powers would not abandon them. The candy parachutes reinforced this trust in tangible form that children could catch, taste, and share. The trust built during the airlift influenced political decisions made later. West Berlin consistently voted to maintain Western alignment despite hardships this caused, despite Soviet pressure, despite the wall's construction isolating the city from surrounding East German territory. the memory of who brought food during the blockade and who imposed the blockade shaped political consciousness for generation. Gale Halvorsen recognized his role in this larger narrative, but emphasized the personal scale. In speeches given throughout retirement, he returned repeatedly to the theme that small acts of kindness create consequences beyond calculation. 2 sticks of gum, divided among 30 children, should have meant nothing, a gesture too small to matter. Instead, it initiated operation that delivered 23 tons of candy, generated 250,000 letters from German children, created relationships that lasted lifetimes. He told Mercedes' story frequently, describing the letter about white chickens, the package he mailed in response, the dinner in 1972 that revealed the child had become a woman who preserved his letter for 24 years. The story resonated because it contained elements audiences understood. Everyone has received a meaningful letter, helped a stranger, made a small gesture that mattered more than expected. The airlift statistics intimidate: 2.3 million tons delivered through coordination of thousands of aircraft and personnel. Operation Little Vittel's statistics invite participation. Handkerchief, string, candy, simple materials combined through simple process to create parachutes that carried hope along with chocolate. American schools teaching the Berlin airlift often included projects making candy parachutes, teaching children the knot that Halvorsen and his crew developed, explaining the engineering that allows handkerchief to function as parachute canopy. The hands-on lesson made history. Tangible, transforming abstract operation into concrete action that students could replicate. This educational approach preserved the operation's memory beyond the veteran generation, ensuring that children born decades after the airlift learned not only that it happened, but how it happened, the specific techniques and decisions that ordinary people use to accomplish extraordinary result. Mercedes Wild participated in many such educational programs, bringing the German perspective to airlift commemorations, describing the experience of being the hungry child who benefited from American generosity. Her presence added authenticity that no textbook could provide. Students could ask questions directly to someone who lived the history, learning details that written accounts omit, understanding the emotional reality behind historical facts. When Gale Halvorsen died February 16, 2022, Mercedes Wild was among those mourning a friend, not merely a historical figure. Their friendship, spanning from their 1972 meeting through regular contact over 5 decades, represented the airlift's ultimate success. The operation succeeded operationally by delivering sufficient supplies to sustain Berlin through blockade. It succeeded strategically by demonstrating Western capability and resolve, contributing to Soviet decision to lift the blockade. It succeeded diplomatically by transforming former enemies into allies who built NATO and European Union. But it succeeded most profoundly in human terms by creating relationships like that between Mercedes and Gale, relationships that proved reconciliation remains possible even after total war, that individuals can transcend the hatreds their governments manufacture, that small acts of kindness can echo across decades. The white chickens Mercedes mentioned in her 1948 letter vanished into history, consumed, or died, or simply forgotten amid Berlin's reconstruction. But the letter itself survived, preserved carefully through 74 years as of this writing, yellowing paper carrying fading ink that documents a moment when one child asked for fairness and one adult responded with kindness. The letter represents more than correspondence between pilot and child. It represents the possibility of choosing connection over division, compassion over hatred, the personal over the political. In a century marked by industrial-scale violence, by wars that killed millions, by bombing campaigns that erased cities, by hatreds that consumed generations, the letter offers quiet counter-testimony that individuals retain power to choose differently. If this story gave you a new way to see the meaning of reconciliation after war, share and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the history that changed the world.